The story of House Stark begins not in recorded history, but in the mists of legend, when the Age of Heroes still held sway over the known world and the First Men ruled the lands that would one day be called the Seven Kingdoms. In those ancient times, before the Andals crossed the narrow sea with their seven-pointed star and their steel, the North belonged to a different breed of men entirely. They were the children of the First Men. Those hardy pioneers who had crossed the land bridge from Essos 8,000 years before the conquest, bringing with them bronze weapons and a fierce determination to carve out new homes in this strange and haunted land. The First Men who ventured into the north found a realm unlike anything they had known in Essos. Vast forests of pine and sentinel and oak stretched for hundreds of miles, broken only by rivers, lakes, and the occasional clearing. The land was cold, far colder than the territories they had left behind, and the winters were unlike anything they had experienced. In Essos, winter meant cooler temperatures and perhaps some snow. In the north, winter meant months or years of darkness and cold that could kill the unwary in hours. The very air seemed different here, charged with something ancient and powerful that defied explanation. When the First Men first arrived, they found the north already inhabited. The children of the forest, those small, secretive beings with their dappled skin and strange magic, had lived in these lands since time immemorial. They were one with the forests, communicating with animals, singing songs to the trees, and working magic that the First Men could barely comprehend. At first, there was war between the newcomers and the original inhabitants. The First Men, with their bronze axes, began cutting down the weirwood trees. Those pale-barked trees, with their blood-red leaves and carved faces that were sacred to the children. The children fought back with their obsidian weapons and their greenseers who could see through the eyes of animals and weirwood trees. The war between the First Men and the children of the forest raged for generations, devastating both populations and transforming the landscape. The children's magic was powerful, but the First Men had numbers and determination on their side. Entire forests were felled, weirwood groves were destroyed, and the children were pushed further and further into the wild places. But the children were not defenseless. They could send wolves and shadow cats against the First Men. Their greenseers could spy on enemy movements and direct attacks with uncanny precision. Most terrifying of all, the legends said that in their desperation, the children shattered the land bridge that connected Westeros to Essos, drowning the Arm of Dawn in a cataclysm that sent massive waves crashing against both coasts. Eventually, exhausted by centuries of warfare and facing mutual destruction, the First Men and the children of the forest made peace. The pact, as it came to be known, was sworn on the Isle of Faces in the Great Lake called God's Eye. The First Men agreed to stop cutting down weirwood trees and to leave the deep forests to the children. In exchange, the children agreed to allow the First Men to farm the open lands and build their settlements. To seal this agreement, the First Men adopted the worship of the old gods, those nameless deities that the children venerated, and learned to respect the weirwood trees and the natural world. Among all the families that rose to prominence during this primordial epoch, none would prove more enduring or more central to the story of Westeros than House Stark of Winterfell. Their words, simple yet profound, would echo through 8,000 years of history. Winter is coming. Not a boast or a threat, but a statement of cold, hard reality that defined the northern philosophy of life itself. The north was harsh, unforgiving, and demanded constant vigilance. Those who forgot the lessons of winter did not survive to pass on their foolishness to the next generation. The founding of House Stark is inextricably linked to the most legendary figure of the Age of Heroes, a man whose very name has become synonymous with northern identity and resilience. Bran the Builder, they called him, though whether this was truly his name or merely a title bestowed by grateful descendants remains lost to the fog of ages. The tales say he lived during the Long Night, that terrible winter that lasted a generation and brought with it terrors that still haunt northern nightmares. When darkness covered the world and the White Walkers descended from the lands of always winter with their armies of the dead, It was Brandon Stark who rallied the living and helped turn back the tide of death itself. The Long Night stands as the defining event of the Age of Heroes, the nightmare that forged the Northern character in fire and ice. According to the oldest tales, preserved in songs and stories passed down through countless generations, the darkness fell suddenly and without warning. The sun rose one morning and then simply failed to set again, or perhaps it set and never rose. The accounts differ, blurred by time and the tendency of stories to grow in the telling. But all agree on the essential facts. Darkness covered the world. Temperatures plummeted to levels that killed exposed humans in minutes. And from the north came creatures that should have existed only in nightmares. The White Walkers, the Others as they were sometimes called, were beings of ice and cold and death. They stood taller than men, with eyes that glowed blue like frozen stars and armor that seemed made of ice itself. They carried blades of ice that shattered steel and bronze, leaving wounds that never healed and corpses that rose as mindless servants. Worse still, every person they killed became one of them, a wight bound to their service, so that their army grew with every battle they won. The living were forced to burn their own dead to prevent them from rising, a practice that violated every custom and tradition but became absolutely necessary for survival. The war against the Others tested humanity to its breaking point. Traditional warfare proved useless against an enemy that felt no fear, required no supplies, and gained strength from every defeat they inflicted. Entire villages and castles were overrun, their populations slaughtered or converted into whites. The survivors fled south, seeking refuge in whatever strongholds remained. But the Others followed, patient and inexorable as winter itself. It seemed as though humanity might be wiped from the face of the earth, leaving the world to eternal cold and darkness. But humanity did not face this threat alone. The children of the forest, despite their own dwindling numbers and the recent war with the First Men, joined the fight against the common enemy. They brought their magic, their knowledge of the land, and their obsidian weapons that could kill others when steel and bronze failed. Unlikely alliances formed as survival took precedence over old grievances. Giants, those enormous beings who had been pushed into the far north by human expansion, brought their immense strength to the fight. The First Men, led by heroes whose names would echo through the ages, learned to fight an enemy unlike any they had faced before. The legends surrounding Bran the Builder have grown so elaborate over the millennia that separating fact from myth has become impossible. The singers claim he built Winterfell, the ancient castle that would serve as the seat of Stark power for 8,000 years. They say he raised Storm's End in the south, though this seems unlikely given the distances involved and the territorial divisions of that ancient age. Most importantly, the stories insist that after the defeat of the Others, Bran the Builder raised the Wall, that colossal fortification of ice and ancient magic that stretches 300 miles across the northern frontier, standing 700 feet high and protecting the realms of men from whatever darkness still lurks beyond. The construction of the wall represents one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in human history, even accounting for the exaggerations that surely must have crept into the tales. The Maesters, with their chains and their skepticism, argue that no structure of such magnitude could have been built by primitive peoples using Bronze Age technology. They suggest the wall grew over centuries through accumulated ice and snow, enhanced by the magic of the children of the forest. But the small folk of the north tell a different story. They say the giants helped raise the wall, those enormous beings who once roamed the forests and mountains before dwindling to extinction. They say the children of the forest wove their green magic into the very foundations, creating a barrier that no servant of the Great Other could pass. And they say Bran the Builder sealed ancient spells into the ice itself, protections that endure to this day. The wall was more than mere ice and stone. Ancient spells were woven into its foundations, creating a magical barrier that prevented the Others and their whites from passing. These enchantments were so powerful that even thousands of years later, whites brought south of the wall collapsed into lifeless corpses, their animating force severed by the barrier. The wall was built not just as a physical obstacle, but as a metaphysical boundary between life and death, warmth and cold, civilization and the wilderness beyond. Every stone, every foot of ice, every carved rune that marked the gates and watchtowers contributed to a defensive system that went far beyond what mere engineering could accomplish. The construction process itself, as described in the oldest tales, required cooperation between many different groups. The first men provided the labor and the organizational skills necessary for such a massive undertaking. The children of the forest contributed their magic, weaving spells into the foundations that would endure for millennia. The giants, with their enormous strength, moved blocks of ice and stone that no human could have managed. And Brandon Stark, the builder, coordinated all these efforts, somehow convincing disparate groups who had recently been at war with each other to work toward a common goal. The political and diplomatic skills this required may have been as impressive as the engineering achievement itself. The wall was constructed with 19 great fortresses strung along its length, massive castles carved from ice and stone that could each house thousands of men. These castles were positioned to provide mutual support, with signal fires and messenger ravens allowing communication along the entire length of the wall within hours. The largest and most important of these fortresses was Castle Black, positioned roughly in the center of the wall where the King's Road terminated. Eastwatch by the Sea guarded the eastern end, where the wall met the ocean, while the Shadow Tower watched the western approaches near the gorge. Each fortress had its own deep wells, massive storerooms capable of holding supplies for years, and thick walls that could withstand siege. The top of the wall was wide enough for 12 mounted knights to ride abreast, creating a highway in the sky that allowed rapid movement of forces to wherever they were needed. Wooden staircases, rebuilt over the centuries as they wore out, provided access to the top, though the climb was long and exhausting. Later, the Watch would install primitive elevators, iron cages pulled by enormous winches that could carry men and supplies to the summit. These elevators remained terrifying to use, creaking and swaying as they ascended, but they were far preferable to climbing 700 feet of icy stairs. Beyond the wall lay a wilderness that few had explored and fewer still had returned from alive. The haunted forest, vast and ancient, stretched north for hundreds of miles, broken only by frozen rivers and the occasional mountain range. The lands beyond were home to creatures that seemed like something from nightmares. Giant spiders with bodies the size of hounds, direwolves far larger than the ordinary wolves of the south, shadow cats and other predators that viewed humans as prey. And somewhere in the frozen wastes beyond even the haunted forest lay the lands of always winter, where the others were said to have their strongholds, if they had such things. Whether through supernatural assistance or merely through the determination and ingenuity that would come to characterize House Stark, the wall was built, and Brandon Stark emerged from the long night as one of the most powerful lords in the newly reclaimed lands. The castle he built at Winterfell took advantage of natural hot springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth, where the heat of the world's heart still burned strong. These springs were channeled through the walls and foundations of Winterfell, creating a fortress that remained warm even in the depths of winter when the cold killed men who ventured unprepared into the Wolfswood. The warmth was more than physical comfort. It was a symbol of House Stark's role as the defenders of life against the eternal cold. The selection of the site for Winterfell demonstrated both practical wisdom and an appreciation for the symbolic significance of place. The castle was built on land where 3 wolf packs had traditionally met, a fact that was commemorated in the 3-headed direwolf that would eventually become the Stark sigil. The hot springs that fed the castle's heating system had been sacred to the children of the forest, and the first men who built Winterfell recognized this sacredness by preserving the ancient weirwood grove and building the castle around it rather than destroying it. This respect for the old gods and the ways of the children would become a defining characteristic of House Stark. Winterfell's design reflected the harsh realities of northern life and the lessons learned during the long night. The walls were built thick and strong, capable of withstanding siege for years if properly supplied. The castle included granaries that could store food for thousands of people, deep wells that would never run dry, and armories stocked with weapons that could equip every person within the walls if necessary. But more than mere defensive fortification, Winterfell was designed to be a complete community, capable of sustaining itself indefinitely if cut off from the outside world. The glass gardens, heated by the hot springs, could produce fresh vegetables even in the depths of winter, providing essential nutrition when other sources failed. The Great Keep, rising 8 stories above the courtyard, dominated the castle's skyline and housed the Stark family's private chambers. These rooms, warmed by pipes carrying hot water from the springs, were comfortable enough, though Spartanly furnished by southern standards. The Lords of Winterfell had never been ones for excessive luxury, preferring functionality and durability to mere ornamentation. The furnishings were well made but simple, the decorations practical rather than purely aesthetic. This reflected the northern philosophy that resources should not be wasted on vanity when they might be needed for survival. The Great Hall, where the Lords of Winterfell held court and entertained their bannermen, could accommodate several hundred people for feasts or gatherings. The high table sat on a raised platform, where the Lord and his family could see and be seen by all assembled. The walls were hung with captured weapons and battle standards from centuries of conflicts, each one representing a victory or significant event in Stark history. The hearths at either end of the hall burned massive logs throughout the winter, adding their heat to that provided by the hot spring pipes, creating an atmosphere of warmth and security in the midst of the frozen north. The sept, built to accommodate those few northerners who followed the faith of the Seven, was small and poorly maintained, reflecting the North's adherence to the old gods. Most Starks visited it only when courtesy demanded, preferring the godswood for their devotions. The sept's very existence spoke to Winterfell's role as not just a castle, but a diplomatic center, where visitors from the south had to be accommodated, even if their religious practices seemed strange to northern eyes. But the true heart of Winterfell was the godswood, that 3-acre grove of ancient trees surrounding a black pool of icy water. In the center of the grove grew the heart tree, a massive weirwood whose white bark and blood-red leaves marked it as sacred to the old gods. The face carved into the tree's trunk, done by the children of the forest untold centuries ago, wept red sap like blood and seemed to watch all who entered the grove. This was where the Lords of Winterfell came to contemplate, to make difficult decisions, to commune with the gods who had no names and made no promises. The godswood remained unchanged by human hands, allowed to grow wild and natural, a piece of the ancient world preserved within the castle's walls. The servants who maintained Winterfell numbered in the hundreds, from the steward who managed the castle's day-to-day operations to the lowest scullery maid who scrubbed pots in the kitchens. These people formed a community within the community, many of them descended from families who had served the Starks for generations. They took pride in their service, understanding that their role in maintaining Winterfell contributed to the security and prosperity of the entire North. The relationship between the Starks and their servants was characterized by mutual respect, rather than the haughty condescension that often marked such relationships in the South. The Master-at-Arms maintained constant training in the yards, ensuring that every man who could wield a weapon knew how to use it properly. Young boys began their training as soon as they could lift a wooden sword, learning the basic forms and movements that would eventually develop into true martial skill. The training was hard, sometimes brutal, but it was necessary. The North faced constant threats from wildlings beyond the wall, occasional conflicts with other northern houses, and the ever-present possibility of southern invasion. Every man needed to be ready to fight, and the Master-at-Arms took his responsibility for their training seriously. The Maester, with his grey robes and heavy chain forged from different metals representing different areas of knowledge, served as physician, educator, and advisor to the Lord of Winterfell. The Maesters of the Citadel in Old Town trained for years to earn their chains, studying everything from healing to history, from astronomy to the arts of war. The Maester at Winterfell taught the Stark children their letters, treated their illnesses and injuries, tended to the ravens that carried messages across the realm, and provided counsel on matters ranging from agriculture to politics. His role was indispensable, though some maesters found service in the north challenging, far from the sophistication and the early history of House Stark consists largely of consolidation and expansion, as the descendants of Bran the Builder gradually extended their authority over the vast northern territories. The north, being larger than all the other 6 kingdoms combined, presented unique challenges to any would-be ruler. The distances were vast, the climate brutal, and the people fiercely independent. The smaller kings and lords who ruled various regions saw no reason to submit to Stark authority merely because of old legends about the Long Night. Power, they understood, had to be earned and maintained through strength, cunning, and the occasional demonstration of force. The Kings of Winter, as the early Stark rulers styled themselves, spent generations bringing the northern houses to heel. Some submitted peacefully, recognizing the advantages of joining with a powerful overlord who could provide protection and mediate disputes. Others had to be convinced through less gentle means. The Boltons of the Dreadfort, who wore flayed men on their banners and practiced the ancient custom of wearing the skins of their defeated enemies, proved particularly resistant to Stark authority. For thousands of years, the Boltons would remain the most dangerous and treacherous of the northern houses, their loyalty always suspect, their ambitions always threatening to upset the Northern Order. The Red Kings, as the Boltons styled themselves in those early days, ruled extensive territories along the Weeping Water and claimed dominion over lands the Starks considered their own. The wars between the two houses were brutal affairs, characterized by atrocities on both sides. The Boltons practiced flaying, while the Starks, despite their later reputation for honor, were no strangers to harsh justice when dealing with rebellion. The conflict only ended when the Starks finally conquered the Dreadfort after a prolonged siege and forced the Boltons to give up their traditional practice of flaying their enemies, at least officially. The rumors persisted that in the dungeons beneath the Dreadfort, the old ways continued in secret, a dark reminder that some traditions died hard in the ancient families of the North. The integration of the Barrowlands into the Stark Kingdom represented another significant achievement of the early Kings of Winter. The Barrow Kings, who ruled from Barrowton and claimed descent from the first king who had led the first men across the land bridge, possessed considerable power and prestige. Their lands were rich by northern standards, their armies substantial, and their pride even greater. But the Starks, through a combination of marriage alliances and military campaigns, eventually brought the Dustins and other Barrowland houses into their growing kingdom. The process took centuries and required patience, diplomacy, and occasional displays of overwhelming force. The conquest of the Three Sisters, those rocky islands in the Bight that guarded the approaches to White Harbor, proved more difficult than subduing the mainland territories. The Sistermen were pirates and smugglers, more at home on the sea than on land, and they had little interest in bending the knee to any king. They raided the northern coast with impunity, carrying off goods and people for ransom or sale in the markets of Essos. The Starks, being primarily a land-based power, lacked the naval strength to effectively control the islands. The solution came through alliance with House Manderley, who would later provide the Starks with the naval power they needed. But even then, the Three Sisters remained troublesome subjects, frequently switching their allegiance to the Vale when it suited their interests. White Harbor itself came under Stark control through one of the more unusual chapters in Northern history. House Manderley, fleeing persecution in the Reach after backing the wrong side in a civil war, arrived at the mouth of the White Knife seeking refuge. The Starks, recognizing opportunity when it presented itself, granted the Manderleys lands and protection in exchange for their loyalty and their expertise in commerce and shipbuilding. The Manderleys brought southern sophistication to the north, building White Harbor into a true city, the only settlement in the north that could properly claim that title. They also brought the faith of the Seven, making them somewhat unusual among the northern houses who still kept the old gods. But their loyalty to House Stark never wavered, and they proved time and again that they were Northerners in all the ways that mattered. The relationship between House Stark and the Night's Watch evolved over the millennia into something approaching religious devotion. The Starks understood, perhaps better than any other great house, that the Watch was all that stood between civilization and whatever horrors lurked beyond the wall. Every generation of Stark sent younger sons to take the Black, strengthening the bond between house and order. The Kings of Winter personally led ranging beyond the wall on occasion, venturing into the haunted forest to confront wildlings, giants, and worse. They understood that the oath the Watch swore, to be the shield that guards the realms of men, was not mere rhetoric but a sacred trust that demanded support from those who ruled in comfort while the brothers froze on the wall. The Stark custom of having the Lord of Winterfell personally execute those he condemned to death emerged from the harsh realities of ruling the North. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, as the saying went. It was a principle that forced rulers to take personal responsibility for their judgments, to look into the eyes of the condemned and see them as human beings rather than abstractions. This tradition would endure through 8,000 years of Stark rule, maintained even during the centuries when the family had become wardens rather than kings, and it would shape the character of every lord who wielded ice, the ancestral Valyrian steel. The arrival of the Andals in Westeros 6,000 years before Aegon's conquest represented an existential threat to the culture and identity of the First Men. In the south, the invaders overwhelmed the indigenous kingdoms through superior numbers, better weapons, and the religious fervor of the Seven. They conquered the Vale, then the Riverlands, and gradually spread their influence throughout the kingdoms that would eventually become known as the Seven. Ancient dynasties fell, old gods were replaced by new, and the culture of the First Men was systematically eroded. But in the north, things went differently. Theon Stark, remembered as the Hungry Wolf, met the Andal threat with a ferocity that sent shockwaves throughout Westeros. When the Andals attempted to establish a foothold in the north, crossing at the Three Sisters, or sailing up the eastern coast, Theon did not wait for them to land and establish themselves. He took the fight to them, sailing to the Sisters and then across the narrow sea to Andalos itself, where he burned villages and killed so many of the invaders that they named him a demon. His message was clear. The North would not fall as the South had fallen. The old ways would endure. The success of the North in repelling the Andal invasion had profound and lasting effects on Northern culture and identity. While the Southern kingdoms adopted the faith of the Seven and gradually abandoned worship of the old gods, the North remained true to the nameless deities of forest and stream, of earth and stone. The weirwood groves, with their carved faces weeping red sap like blood, continued to serve as places of worship and judgment. The practice of keeping the old gods separated the Northerners from their Southern counterparts in ways that transcended mere religious differences. It was a marker of identity, a reminder that the North remembered things the rest of Westeros had forgotten. The maintenance of the old ways meant more than just religious observance. It represented a comprehensive worldview that emphasized duty over glory, survival over comfort, and community over individual ambition. The Northerners understood that in a land where winter could kill the unprepared and unwary, cooperation was not optional, but necessary. The practice of hospitality became sacred under guest right, where even the most hated enemy must be treated with courtesy once they had eaten bread and salt beneath your roof. To violate guest right was to commit a sin so heinous that even the gods, old and new, would turn their faces away. This understanding of mutual obligation created a social fabric stronger than any in the South, where knightly codes and flowery courtesies often masked treachery and ambition. The Age of Heroes gave way to more historical times, though the exact chronology remains murky until relatively recent centuries. The Stark kings continued to rule from Winterfell, their power waxing and waning with the competence of individual monarchs and the challenges they faced. Some kings of Winter expanded their territories, bringing new lands under Stark control. Others barely maintained what their ancestors had won. But through it all, the house endured, weathering storms both literal and political that would have destroyed lesser dynasties. The arrival of Aegon the Conqueror and his dragons 3 centuries before the present day forced the most significant political decision in House Stark's long history. Torrhen Stark, king in the north, marched south with 30,000 men, intending to meet the Targaryen invader and defend northern independence. But when he reached the banks of the Trident and saw what Dragonfire could do, witnessed the devastation wreaked upon the combined armies of the Reach and the Rock at the Field of Fire, Torrhen made a choice that would haunt some and relieve others for generations to come. He knelt. The decision to submit to Targaryen rule without battle earned Torrhen the nickname the King Who Knelt, a title that could be interpreted as either insult or praise depending on one's perspective. His detractors said he was a coward, that the old kings of winter would never have surrendered without a fight regardless of the odds. His supporters argued that he was wise, that he saved 30,000 northern lives and preserved the North's autonomy in all but name. The truth, as is often the case, likely falls somewhere between these extremes. Torrhen recognized that fighting dragons was suicide, that the death of 30,000 men would leave the North defenseless against wildling raids and internal rebellion, and that submission might preserve more of what mattered than a glorious but pointless death. The transformation from kingdom to subject territory proved less traumatic than might have been expected. The Targaryens, focused on consolidating their rule in the south and dealing with Dornish resistance, largely left the north to govern itself. The Starks continued to rule from Winterfell, now as wardens rather than kings, but their authority over the northern houses remained effectively unchanged. They dispensed justice, collected taxes, raised armies when needed, and maintained the traditions that had sustained the North through millennia. The only significant difference was that they now owed fealty to a king in King's Landing, rather than wearing a crown themselves. The relationship between House Stark and the Targaryen dynasty proved remarkably stable over the following 3 centuries. The Starks bent the knee, paid their taxes, and sent men south when called upon for war. In exchange, the Targaryens allowed the North to maintain its distinct culture, worship its old gods, and govern itself according to ancient customs. This arrangement suited both parties. The Targaryens gained the nominal submission of the largest kingdom in Westeros, and a reliable source of military strength. The Starks retained everything that truly mattered while avoiding the dangers of independence in an age of dragons. The Starks stayed notably neutral during the Dance of the Dragons, that devastating civil war that tore the realm apart and killed most of the Targaryen dragons. Lord Cregan Stark, known as the Old Man of the North despite his relative youth, eventually marched south with a great host, but by the time he arrived, the war had effectively ended. His brief tenure as Hand of the King, lasting only a day, became legendary. He dispensed justice to those who had murdered the young King Aegon III's mother, then returned to the north, wanting nothing more to do with southern politics. This episode exemplified the northern approach to involvement in realm-wide affairs. Fulfill your obligations, do your duty, then go home and leave the southerners to their schemes. The centuries of Targaryen rule saw numerous Stark lords come and go, some remembered for great deeds, others forgotten except in the records maintained by the Maesters. Rodwell Stark fought in the Blackfyre Rebellion, leading northern forces to support the Targaryens against the Bastard Pretender. Brandon Stark, called Ice Eyes, dealt with a wildling invasion so severe that he had to call upon the Night's Watch for assistance. Cregan Stark, a later lord sharing the name of his famous ancestor, negotiated the marriage alliance that would eventually bring Lyanna Stark into the world and set in motion the events that would topple the Targaryen dynasty. The practice of fostering played an important role in maintaining bonds between great houses, and the Starks participated in these arrangements like any other noble family. Young Starks went south to squire for southern lords or ward with allied houses, learning the ways of the wider realm while representing northern interests. Similarly, Winterfell regularly hosted the children of other houses, creating bonds of friendship and understanding that served political purposes while enriching the lives of the individuals involved. These fostering arrangements created a web of personal relationships that complemented the formal structures of fealty and allegiance. Life at Winterfell during the centuries of Targaryen rule fell into predictable patterns shaped by the northern climate and the demands of governance. The castle, built partially over those ancient hot springs, housed the Stark family, their household guard, their servants, and often several hundred other people who sought the protection of its walls or had business with the wardens of the north. The Great Hall hosted feasts during important celebrations, where northern lords gathered to swear their oaths and settle disputes. The glass gardens, heated by the hot springs, provided fresh vegetables, even in the depths of winter. The Godswood, with its ancient weirwood tree whose face had been carved by the children of the forest, remained the spiritual heart of the castle. The daily rhythm of life at Winterfell reflected the practical necessities of northern existence. Training in the yard prepared young men for the warfare that remained a constant threat, whether from wildling raids, feuds between northern houses, or the occasional call to arms from King's Landing. The women of the household managed the complex logistics of feeding and clothing hundreds of people, overseeing the servants, and maintaining the social fabric that held the castle community together. Children learned their letters from the maester, their devotions in the Godswood, and the traditions of their house from their parents. It was a life of duty and responsibility, but also of genuine warmth and community. The relationship between the Starks and their bannermen followed patterns established over millennia. The great houses of the north, those powerful enough to field significant forces and rule extensive territories, owed their fealty directly to Winterfell. House Umber held the last hearth, closest to the wall, and bearing the brunt of wildling raids. House Karstark, a cadet branch that split from the main Stark line 1,000 years ago, ruled from Carhold in the northeast. House Manderley, still more southern in their customs but fiercely loyal, commanded White Harbor and provided the Starks with naval power and commercial expertise. House Bolton, always dangerous, always watched carefully, maintained the Dreadfort, and dreamed of supplanting the Starks as they had for thousands of years. The relationship between Winterfell and the Umbers exemplified the bonds that held the North together. The Umbers, whose lands stretched along the last river almost to the wall itself, faced constant danger from wildling raids. Their castle, Last Hearth, was aptly named, being the last stronghold before the wilderness beyond the wall. The Umbers were a hardy people, tall and fierce, known for their strength in battle and their absolute loyalty to House Stark. When the Stark called, the Umbers answered, regardless of the season or the danger. This loyalty was not blind obedience, but rather the product of centuries of mutual support and shared sacrifice. The Starks protected the Umbers' lands when necessary, mediated their disputes with other houses, and stood by them through hard winters and harder wars. The Karstarks, being descended from a younger son of House Stark, maintained an especially close relationship with Winterfell. Legend held that a Stark son named Kalon had led the defeat of a rebel lord 1,000 years ago and been granted lands for his valor, founding what would become House Karstark. Whether or not the story was literally true, the Karstarks certainly shared the Stark look, with their long faces and dark hair, and they took pride in their descent from the ancient kings of winter. Their loyalty to Winterfell was a matter of blood as much as feudal obligation, though this closeness sometimes created expectations and resentments that simpler vassalage relationships avoided. The Manderleys represented an unusual case among the northern houses, being originally from the south and maintaining southern customs even after centuries in the north. They worshipped the Seven instead of the old gods, built in stone rather than wood, and practiced the elaborate courtesies of southern chivalry. Yet their loyalty to House Stark was unquestionable, forged through the Starks' generosity in granting them refuge when they had nowhere else to turn. The Manderleys never forgot that the Starks had saved them from destruction, and they repaid that debt through centuries of faithful service. White Harbor, the city they built, became the North's window on the wider world. a center of trade and commerce that enriched the entire region. The Boltons remained the great exception to northern loyalty, the house that was always suspected, always watched, always dangerous. Their ancient enmity with the Starks dated back to the Age of Heroes, when the Red Kings of the Dreadfort had ruled their own kingdom and practiced the custom of flaying their enemies. The Starks had eventually conquered the Boltons and forced them to abandon their most barbaric practices, at least publicly. But the old hatreds never truly died, and every generation of Starks had to watch the Boltons carefully, knowing that given the opportunity, they would happily restore their kingdom and resume their old ways. The flayed man on their banner remained a constant reminder of what they had been and what they might become again. The smaller houses, too numerous to list completely, each played their role in the northern hierarchy. The mountain clans, including the Wolves, the Norries, the Liddles, and the Flints, remained among the most loyal of Stark bannermen, their isolation in the mountains preserving traditions that even other northerners considered ancient. These clans lived hard lives in unforgiving terrain, scratching out existence from thin soil and harsh weather, but they were proud, fierce, and absolutely devoted to the Starks, whom they still called the Kings of Winter despite 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. When the Stark called, the clansmen would leave their mountains and march to war, armed with whatever weapons they possessed, ready to die for the old blood. The Crannogmen of the Neck, led by House Reed from Greywater Watch, provided invaluable service as scouts and guerrilla fighters, their knowledge of the swamps making them virtually unbeatable in their home territory. The Crannogmen were small people, barely taller than children, but they were skilled hunters and fishermen who could move through the marshes without leaving a trace. Their loyalty to House Stark was absolute, dating back to legends of a Stark saving a Crannogman from attackers. The Reed Lords served not just as bannermen but as close friends and advisors to the Starks, a relationship that transcended normal feudal bonds. The practice of fostering, where noble children were sent to be raised in the households of other lords, strengthened the bonds between houses and created personal relationships that could be crucial in times of crisis. Young Starks went south to learn the ways of other kingdoms, while the sons and daughters of other northern houses came to Winterfell to be educated alongside Stark children. These fostered children learned more than just letters and swordplay. They absorbed the values and customs of their host family, creating loyalties that often lasted a lifetime. The friendships formed during these fostering periods could determine the course of wars and the fates of kingdoms. Northern culture emphasized endurance over elegance, duty over glory, and practical skills over courtly accomplishments. A northern lord was expected to be able to handle a sword, judge the weather, manage his lands, and dispense justice fairly. He was not expected to compose poetry, play musical instruments, or engage in the elaborate courtesies that Southerners valued. This practical orientation extended to all aspects of life. Northern clothing was functional rather than fashionable, designed to keep the wearer warm and dry rather than to impress observers. Northern food was hearty and filling, meant to sustain hard-working bodies through long days of physical labor. Northern houses were built for warmth and defense rather than beauty and display. The Northern attitude toward women reflected this practical orientation, while still maintaining traditional gender roles. Women managed households that were complex economic enterprises, overseeing servants, maintaining accounts, organizing food production and preservation, and generally keeping their families alive through long winters. This work was valued and respected, recognized as essential to survival, even if it lacked the glamour of warfare and politics. Northern women were expected to be strong, capable, and resilient, able to manage in their husband's absence and to defend their homes if necessary. Stories of northern women taking up arms to defend their castles were not common, but were not unknown either, and such women were generally celebrated rather than condemned for their unfeminine behavior. The worship of the old gods shaped northern culture in profound ways that went beyond mere religious observance. The old gods had no temples, no priests, no holy books or formal doctrines. They were worshipped in the godswoods, among the weirwood trees whose faces seemed to watch all who entered. The relationship between worshipper and deity was personal and private, unmediated by religious authorities or elaborate rituals. A man went into the godswood alone, spoke to the gods, or simply sat in silence, and found whatever peace or wisdom the gods chose to grant. This individualistic approach to religion fostered a culture that valued personal integrity and individual conscience over obedience to external authority. The practice of guest right represented the most sacred custom in the North, more binding than any written law. Once a guest had eaten bread and salt beneath a host's roof, both parties were bound by obligations that could not be violated without committing a crime against gods and men. The guest must offer no harm to his host's household, while the host must provide protection and hospitality regardless of any previous enmity. This custom enabled enemies to meet and negotiate without fear of treachery, creating spaces where conflicts could be resolved through words rather than weapons. The violation of guest right was considered so heinous that even the perpetrator's own followers might turn against them, understanding that a crime against such a fundamental custom threatened the social fabric itself. The northern approach to justice emphasized personal responsibility and proportionate punishment. The stark tradition of the Lord personally executing those he condemned stemmed from the principle that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. This practice forced lords to take full responsibility for their judgments, to look into the eyes of the condemned and see them as human beings rather than abstractions. It was hard, but it was honest, and it created a justice system where executions were not casual or arbitrary but serious acts that weighed heavily on those who ordered them. The contrast with southern practices, where lords delegated execution to professional headsmen and could order deaths without ever confronting the reality of what they had done, highlighted fundamental differences in how the North and the South understood power and responsibility. The smaller houses, too numerous to list completely, each played their role in the northern hierarchy. The mountain clans, including the Wolds, the Norries, the Liddles, and the Flints, remained among the most loyal of Stark bannermen, their isolation in the mountains preserving traditions that even other northerners considered ancient. The Crannogmen of the Neck, led by House Reed from Greywater Watch, provided invaluable service as scouts and guerrilla fighters, their knowledge of the swamps making them virtually unbeatable in their home territory. Each house, from the mightiest to the most humble, formed a thread in the complex web of obligation and loyalty. Robert's Rebellion, which erupted in the year 282 after Aegon's conquest, would prove to be a watershed moment in Stark history, and would set in motion events that would eventually bring the house to the brink of extinction. The rebellion began with a personal tragedy that demonstrated the madness of Aerys II Targaryen, and the vulnerability of even great houses when they became entangled in the schemes of the capital. Brandon Stark, the eldest son and heir of Lord Rickard, was betrothed to Catelyn Tully when word reached him that Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had allegedly abducted his sister Lyanna. Brandon, young and hot-blooded, rode straight to King's Landing and called for Rhaegar to come out and face him. The Mad King's response exceeded even the worst expectations. Rather than simply imprisoning the foolish young man for his outburst, Aerys arrested Brandon and the companions who had ridden with him, then summoned their fathers to court to answer for their son's crimes. Lord Rickard Stark, along with his guards and several other northern lords, traveled south, expecting to find his son facing charges and punishment. Instead, Aerys, in a display of sadistic cruelty that demonstrated his complete descent into madness, staged a mockery of justice. He had Rickard suspended from the rafters of the throne room wearing full armor, with a fire lit beneath him. Brandon was placed nearby with a leather cord around his neck attached to a strangulation device, told that if he could reach his sword, he could save his father. As Rickard roasted alive inside his armor, Brandon strangled himself trying to reach the weapon. The murder of both the Lord of Winterfell and his heir in such a horrific manner would have been cause enough for rebellion, but Aerys compounded his crimes by demanding that Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale and guardian to both Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, send him the heads of his wards. This demand forced Jon Arryn to choose between betraying his foster sons and rebelling against his king. Being a man of honor, he chose rebellion. Robert Baratheon, who had been betrothed to Lyanna Stark and loved her with the passion of youth, needed no convincing to take up arms. Eddard Stark, suddenly finding himself Lord of Winterfell and desperate to avenge his father and brother, called the Banners of the North. The North's contribution to Robert's rebellion proved crucial to the ultimate success of the uprising. The Northern Army, though smaller than the forces that could be fielded by the Reach or the Westerlands, possessed qualities that made it formidable. Northern soldiers were hardy, capable of enduring hardships that would break Southern men. They were loyal to their commanders in ways that went beyond mere feudal obligation, and they were led by a young man who, despite his inexperience, inspired confidence through his quiet competence and clear sense of purpose. Eddard Stark lacked his brother Brandon's fire and Robert Baratheon's battlefield charisma, but he possessed qualities of steady leadership that served the rebellion well. The Battle of the Trident, where Robert Baratheon slew Prince Rhaegar Targaryen in single combat amid the shallow waters of the Ruby Ford, effectively ended the Targaryen dynasty's hold on the Iron Throne. The Northern forces fought with distinction in this crucial engagement, though their role was overshadowed by Robert's dramatic confrontation with the Dragon Prince. After the battle, the rebel army marched on King's Landing, only to find that Tywin Lannister had arrived first, sacked the city, and presented Robert with the corpses of the Targaryen children as proof of his loyalty to the new regime. Eddard Stark's friendship with Robert Baratheon, forged during their shared fostering at the Eyrie and tempered in the crucible of rebellion, fractured over the murdered Targaryen children. Ned, raised on northern concepts of honor and proper warfare, found the killing of children abhorrent regardless of their heritage. Robert, pragmatic in the way of men seeking to secure their rule, saw the deaths as necessary to eliminate potential rival claimants. The two men quarreled bitterly, with Ned even leaving Robert's camp for a time. This disagreement presaged the tensions that would eventually destroy their friendship and contribute to the catastrophes that followed. The Tower of Joy, that remote structure in the Red Mountains of Dorne, became the site of the rebellion's final and most mysterious confrontation. Eddard Stark, accompanied by 6 companions including his closest friend Howland Reed, traveled to the tower seeking his sister Lyanna. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life, and shape the destiny of the 7 kingdoms in ways no one could have predicted. 3 knights of the Kingsguard, including the legendary Sir Arthur Dayne, stood guard over the tower, refusing to yield despite the death of their king and prince. The fight that followed left all but 2 men dead, Eddard Stark and Howland Reed. Inside the tower, dying from complications of childbirth, Lyanna Stark made her brother promise something. The exact nature of that promise remained Ned's most carefully guarded secret, but its fruits became apparent when he returned to Winterfell with a bastard son named Jon Snow, born during the war and carried north to be raised at Winterfell, alongside his legitimate children. The boy's mother, Ned claimed, was a woman named Willa, but he refused to speak of the matter further, taking the secret of Jon's parentage to his grave. The truth, that Jon was actually Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, born in circumstances that legitimized his claim to the Iron Throne, would not come to light until after Ned's death. Eddard Stark's decision to raise Jon at Winterfell as his bastard, allowing the world to believe he had fathered a child on some common-born woman during the rebellion, represented a profound sacrifice. Ned's honor was his defining characteristic, the quality by which he judged himself and was judged by others. To deliberately foster the belief that he had broken his marriage vows and betrayed his wife created a stain on his reputation that would never fully wash away. Catelyn Tully Stark, whom he married on the same day as his brother Brandon was supposed to marry her, never forgave the presence of his supposed bastard in her home. But Ned bore this burden without complaint, understanding that revealing the truth would mean Jon's death at the hands of Robert Baratheon, who had developed an almost pathological hatred. The years following Robert's rebellion saw Eddard Stark attempt to return the North to normalcy after the upheavals of war. The costs had been severe. Thousands of Northern soldiers had died in battles from the Trident to the siege of Storm's End. The Lord of Winterfell and his heir had been murdered by a mad king. The younger daughter had died under mysterious circumstances in Dorne. The North had been bled white, and it would take years to recover. But recover it did, under Ned's patient and competent leadership. Winterfell during Ned's rule became a place of quiet honor and steady governance. He and Catelyn produced 5 legitimate children: Robb, the heir who would grow to be every inch the young wolf; Sansa, beautiful and accomplished in all the southern courtesies; Arya, wild and willful, more wolf than lady; Bran, the curious boy who loved climbing; and Rickon, the youngest, still learning what it meant to be a Stark. Together with Jon Snow, raised alongside them, these children represented the future of House Stark and, though none could know it at the time, key players in the great game that would soon engulf the Seven Kingdoms. The daily life at Winterfell during these years followed patterns established over generations. Ned held court, hearing petitions and settling disputes. He trained with his sons in the yard, teaching them swordcraft and the responsibilities that would one day be theirs. He walked in the Godswood, maintaining the connection to the old gods that defined his spirituality. He ruled, not with the grand gestures favored by southern lords, but with steady competence and clear principles. The small folk of the north prospered under his governance as much as the harsh climate allowed, knowing that their liege lord would deal fairly with them and protect them from injustice. Catelyn Stark, though she never fully reconciled herself to Jon Snow's presence, proved to be a capable Lady of Winterfell. She managed the household, raised the children, and provided Ned with counsel that he often heeded despite his stubborn adherence to honor above pragmatism. She maintained connections with her Tully relatives in the Riverlands, ensuring that the alliance forged during Robert's rebellion remained strong. She embodied the southern customs and courtesies that complemented Ned's northern straightforwardness, making Winterfell a place where both northerners and southerners could feel comfortable. The education of the Stark children reflected the dual nature of their heritage, northern and southern, old ways and new. Maester Luwin taught them their letters, history, and the sciences as understood in the Citadel. Septim Ordain instructed the girls in proper behavior, needlework, and all the accomplishments expected of highborn ladies. Sir Roderick Castle, the Master-at-Arms, trained the boys in combat, teaching them not just swordplay but the responsibilities of command. And through it all, Ned himself imparted the lessons of honor, duty, and the stark realities of justice, personally executing criminals and requiring his sons to witness, teaching them that the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. The arrival of King Robert Baratheon and his court in Winterfell in the year 298, after Aegon's conquest, shattered the peace that had prevailed in the north for nearly 2 decades. Robert, grown fat and dissipated in his years on the throne, sought to bind House Stark more closely to the crown by betrothing his son Joffrey to Sansa Stark, and by asking Ned to become Hand of the King following the death of Jon Arryn. The request placed Ned in an impossible position. His sense of duty and friendship compelled him to help Robert, yet his northern instincts warned him that nothing good came from involvement in southern politics. In the end, duty won, as it always did with Eddard Stark. The decision to travel south as Hand of the King set in motion a cascade of disasters that would bring House Stark to the brink of destruction. In King's Landing, Ned discovered evidence of terrible secrets, that Robert's children were actually the products of incest between Queen Cersei and her twin brother Jaime Lannister, that Jon Arryn had been murdered for discovering this truth, and that the corruption at the heart of the realm ran deeper than anyone imagined. Ned's attempts to do the honorable thing, to give Cersei a chance to flee before he revealed the truth to Robert, resulted in his own destruction when Robert died from a hunting accident, and Joffrey, the bastard-born boy who should never have been king. The execution of Eddard Stark on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor represented a profound miscalculation by the Lannisters and their allies. They had hoped to cow the North into submission by killing its lord and taking his daughters hostage. Instead, they ignited a war that would consume the realm. Robb Stark, barely more than a boy at 15, suddenly found himself Lord of Winterfell and faced with an impossible choice. His father had been murdered as a traitor, his sisters held hostage in King's Landing, his youngest brothers missing, his mother grief-stricken and desperate. By all rights, he should have bent the knee and begged for mercy, hoping to secure his sister's release and preserve what remained of his family. But Robb Stark was his father's son, and the North remembered. The Lords of the North, along with the Lords of the Riverlands who had also suffered under Lannister aggression, gathered at Riverrun and made a decision that echoed through the ages. They proclaimed Robb Stark not just Lord of Winterfell, but King in the North, the first to claim that title since Torrhen Stark had knelt before Aegon the Conqueror 3 centuries earlier. The crown they placed on his head was simple, honest, steel and bronze, decorated with 9 black iron spikes shaped like longsword blades, the same crown the kings of Winter had worn in the ancient days. The young wolf, as Robb came to be called, proved to be a remarkable military commander despite his youth and inexperience. He won every battle he fought, earning comparisons to legendary warriors from the Age of Heroes. At the Battle of the Whispering Wood, he captured Jaime Lannister himself through a brilliant tactical maneuver that combined deception with overwhelming force. At Oxcross, he destroyed a Lannister army and secured the gold mines of Casterly Rock, striking at the source of Lannister wealth. His direwolf, Grey Wind, fought at his side, becoming a terror to his enemies and a symbol of northern power. But for all his tactical brilliance, Robb made strategic and political mistakes that would ultimately prove fatal. His marriage to Jane Westerling, though done for reasons of honor after taking her maidenhood, broke his betrothal to a Frey daughter and alienated Walder Frey, whose support was crucial for controlling the twins and the crossing of the Green Fork. His decision to execute Lord Rickard Karstark for murdering Lannister prisoners was legally and morally correct, but politically disastrous, as it cost him a significant portion of his army. His plan to retake the North from the Ironborn under Theon Greyjoy, while strategically sound, divided his forces and made him vulnerable. The Red Wedding stands as perhaps the darkest moment in Stark history, a betrayal so profound that it sent shockwaves throughout Westeros. Walder Frey, nursing his wounded pride over the broken betrothal, conspired with Roose Bolton and Tywin Lannister to murder Robb Stark, his mother Catelyn, and much of the Northern Army under the protection of Guest Right. The Feast at the Twins, meant to celebrate the marriage of Edmure Tully to a Frey daughter, turned into a slaughterhouse. Grey Wind was killed in his cage, never given a chance to defend his master. Robb died with his mother's name on his lips. Catelyn, forced to watch her son's murder, was herself killed after desperately slitting the throat of a Frey wife in a futile attempt at revenge. The violation of guest right shocked even the hardened warriors and cynical politicians of Westeros. Guest right was sacred, one of the oldest and most universally respected customs in the Seven Kingdoms. To murder someone who had eaten bread and salt beneath your roof was an abomination that earned the condemnation of gods and men alike. The Freys and Boltons might have eliminated the king in the north, but they had damned themselves in the process. The North would not forget, and the day of reckoning would eventually come. The fall of Winterfell itself occurred not through southern conquest, but through the treachery of Theon Greyjoy, who had been raised at Winterfell as Ned Stark's ward following his father's failed rebellion. Theon, desperate to prove himself to his father and his own people, led a small Ironborn force to capture Winterfell while the garrison was deployed south with Robb. His seizure of the castle and his subsequent attempts to hold it demonstrated the fundamental difference between capturing a stronghold and actually ruling it. The Northerners despised him as a turncloak and a traitor, while his own men saw him as more Stark than Greyjoy. When Bran and Rickon Stark escaped from Winterfell with the help of Hodor, Osha, and the Reed siblings, Theon panicked, Unable to recapture the boys, he instead murdered 2 mill children of similar age and displayed their burned bodies as proof that he had killed the Stark heirs. This atrocity, committed in desperation and pride, completed Theon's transformation into someone even he could barely recognize. The arrival of Ramsay Snow, bastard son of Roose Bolton, who claimed to be helping Theon but was actually betraying him, resulted in Winterfell being put to the torch and Theon himself being taken prisoner for years of unimaginable torture. The scattering of the Stark children after the outbreak of war created a diaspora that seemed likely to result in the extinction of the house. Each surviving Stark faced their own trials, their own journey through darkness, that would eventually reshape them into the people they needed to be for the trials ahead. Their paths diverged, taking them to the far corners of the known world, but the bonds of pack remained, even when they seemed most attenuated. Sansa Stark, held captive in King's Landing and forced to play the role of Joffrey's betrothed, learned harsh lessons about the realities of power and the masks people wore in the capital. She survived by being underestimated, by playing the role of a silly girl concerned only with songs and courtesy, while actually absorbing lessons about politics and manipulation from the players of the game around her. Her time in King's Landing, though traumatic, taught her to read people, to understand the subtle currents of power, and to recognize that survival sometimes required compromise and deception. Her escape from King's Landing with the help of Petyr Baelish, while freeing her from immediate danger, placed her in the hands of a different kind of predator. In the Vale, Sansa found herself caught in Littlefinger's schemes, forced to pose as his bastard daughter while he murdered Lysa Arryn and consolidated his control over the Vale. But she also began to develop her own political skills, learning from Petyr while recognizing his essential toxicity. Her understanding of how the game was played grew more sophisticated, and she began to see paths forward that didn't require her to remain a perpetual victim. The process was slow and painful, marked by repeated betrayals and disappointments, but it was transforming her into someone capable of navigating the dangerous waters of Westerosi politics. Arya Stark's journey took her in a completely different direction. Escaping King's Landing with the help of Yoren of the Night's Watch, she began a long odyssey through a war-torn Westeros that stripped away everything that had made her a lady. She witnessed atrocities at Harrenhal, served as cupbearer to Tywin Lannister himself, and learned from the Hound that the world was crueler and more complex than she had imagined. Her list of names, those she meant to kill in revenge for what had been done to her family, became a meditation, a focus for her rage and her will to survive. The journey to Braavos and the House of Black and White represented Arya's descent into an even darker place. Training with the Faceless Men, an ancient order of assassins who worshipped death itself, Arya learned skills that had nothing to do with being a lady or even being Arya Stark. She learned to lie, to kill, to become no one. But despite all the training, despite all the attempts to strip away her identity, Arya remained fundamentally herself. She could not let go of her list, could not forget who she was and what had been done to her family. The wolf remained, sleeping but never truly tamed. Bran Stark's journey was perhaps the strangest of all. His fall from the tower, pushed by Jaime Lannister to protect the secret of the Lannister twins' incest, should have killed him. Instead, it crippled him, taking away his dreams of knighthood and seemingly destroying his future. But the fall also awakened abilities that had lain dormant in his blood. Bran was a warg, capable of entering the minds of animals and controlling them. More than that, he was a greenseer, one of those rare individuals who could see through the eyes of the weirwood trees and perceive events across time and space. His journey beyond the wall with Jojen and Mira Reed, Hodor, and Summer, his direwolf, in search of the three-eyed crow from his dreams, took him into lands and situations that seemed like something from the Age of Heroes. The discovery of the cave where the last greenseer dwelt, the ancient figure merged with the roots of a weirwood tree, marked the beginning of Bran's transformation into something more and less than human. His training in the mysteries of the Greenseers gave him powers that exceeded anything seen in thousands of years, but it also began to erode his humanity, turning him into a living archive of all that had been, and some of what would be. Rickon Stark, the youngest of the Stark children, remains something of a mystery. His escape from Winterfell with Osher, the wildling, and his direwolf Shaggy Dog took him to the island of Skargos, that remote and savage place beyond the knowledge of most Southerners. Reports of what happened there are fragmentary and unreliable, but the boy survived, growing feral and fierce, more wolf than boy. His eventual fate, brought back to civilization only to become a pawn in the schemes of others, demonstrated the cruelty of a world that had no place for innocence. The return of the Starks to power in the north began not with armies or dragons, but with two desperate people finding each other in the darkness. Sansa Stark, fleeing Ramsay Bolton's tortures at Winterfell, where she had been forced to marry him in a mockery of her earlier dreams of marriage, was reunited with Jon Snow, now Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, after he was betrayed and murdered by his own men for allowing the wildlings through the wall. Jon's resurrection by the Red Priestess Melisandre released him from his vows to the Watch, as death had ended his obligation. The two of them, the last Starks as far as they knew, represented the tattered remnants of their once great house. The decision to retake Winterfell from Ramsay Bolton unified what remained of the northern houses around a common cause. House Bolton had betrayed and murdered Robb Stark. Ramsay had brutalized Sansa. The Boltons held Winterfell, the ancient seat of House Stark, and ruled the north with a cruelty that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. The smaller northern houses, the mountain clans, and even some of the larger houses declared for Jon Snow, the White Wolf, willing to follow a bastard of Winterfell rather than continue under Bolton rule. The Battle of the Bastards, fought in the fields before Winterfell's walls, nearly ended in disaster for the Stark forces. Jon, desperate to save his brother Rickon from Ramsay's sadistic games, charged the Bolton line alone, forcing his troops to follow and disrupting the careful battle plan that Sansa and his advisors had crafted. The Bolton forces, superior in numbers and equipment, began to encircle the Stark army, crushing them in a wall of shields and spears. Death seemed certain until the Knights of the Vale, brought by Sansa through her negotiations with Petyr Baelish, smashed into the Bolton flank and turned certain defeat into overwhelming victory. The retaking of Winterfell marked the beginning of the Stark restoration, but the family that returned was fundamentally changed from the one that had been scattered years before. Jon, resurrected and hardened by his experiences beyond the Wall and in the Night's Watch, had lost the idealism of youth without losing his essential honor. Sansa had learned to play the Game of Thrones and recognized that survival sometimes required moral compromises. Arya returned from Braavos, a trained killer, her list of names still unfinished. Bran arrived as something that was barely human anymore, a vessel for thousands of years of memories and visions. The reunion of the surviving Stark children at Winterfell should have been a moment of pure joy, but the people they had become made it complex and bittersweet. They loved each other still, but they had each been changed by their experiences in ways that created distance. Sansa's political maneuvering frustrated Jon's straightforward honor. Arya's new skills and attitudes unsettled everyone. Bran's strange pronouncements and apparent lack of emotion made him difficult to connect with. They were still a pack, still Starks, but the easy affection of their childhood could not be fully recovered. The preparation for the coming war against the Night King and his army of the dead united the North as nothing had since the Long Night itself. The ancient enemy had returned, bringing with it all the terrors that had nearly destroyed humanity 8,000 years before. The White Walkers, thought to be legends and fairy tales used to frighten children, were real, commanding an army of whites that grew with every person killed. And they possessed a dragon now, Viserion, killed beyond the Wall and resurrected to serve the Cold. The Great War, as it would later be called, brought together forces that had never fought alongside each other. Northerners stood with wildlings, their ancient enemies. The Knights of the Vale fought beside the Brotherhood without banners. Dothraki screamers charged alongside unsullied spearmen, and over it all, two living dragons wheeled through the sky, battling their undead brother in aerial combat that recalled the dragons of old Valyria. The defense of Winterfell became the defense of the living itself, the last stand against the eternal cold. The Battle of Winterfell raged through the longest night anyone could remember. The dead came in waves that seemed endless, climbing over their own fallen to reach the walls. The living fought with desperation born of the knowledge that failure meant death, and worse, resurrection as mindless servants of the Night King. Heroes emerged and died throughout that terrible night. Theon Greyjoy, who had once betrayed the Starks, redeemed himself defending Bran in the Godswood. Lyanna Mormont, the young lady of Bear Island, died killing a giant wight. Countless others whose names would never be recorded gave their lives to hold the line. The death of the Night King came not from armies or dragons, but from a single assassin's blade. Arya Stark, using all the skills learned from the Faceless Men and her own natural talents, managed what no one else could achieve. She reached the Night King in the Godswood where he had come to kill Bran, and she drove a Valyrian steel dagger into his chest. The ancient magic that had created the White Walkers and bound the dead to their service unraveled in an instant. The Night King shattered into fragments of ice, and his entire army collapsed, leaving only corpses and silence behind. The victory against the dead should have united the Seven Kingdoms in celebration and reconstruction. Instead, it led directly into more conflict, as Daenerys Targaryen, who had brought her armies north to fight the dead, now turned her attention to completing her conquest of Westeros. Jon Snow, revealed to be Aegon Targaryen, the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne, found himself caught between his love for Daenerys, his loyalty to his family, and his own sense of duty. The tension between these loyalties would lead to tragedy. The destruction of King's Landing by Dragonfire demonstrated that the Targaryen madness had not died with Aerys II. Daenerys, convinced that she would never be loved in Westeros, and therefore must rule through fear, burned the city even after its surrender. The horror of watching hundreds of thousands of innocents die in Dragonfire forced Jon to make an impossible choice. He killed the woman he loved to save the realm from her vision of liberation through fire and blood. The assassination of Daenerys Targaryen in the ruined throne room of the Red Keep marked the end of the Targaryen restoration before it had truly begun. The Great Council that followed convened to decide the future of the Seven Kingdoms after the death of Daenerys and the imprisonment of Jon made a decision that no one had anticipated. They elected Bran Stark, now called Bran the Broken, as king of the Six Kingdoms. The North, under Queen Sansa Stark, chose independence, finally reclaiming the sovereignty that Torrhen Stark had surrendered 3 centuries before. The wheel that Daenerys had promised to break had indeed been broken, but not in the way she had imagined. The new political order that emerged from the ashes of the old represented a radical departure from thousands of years of tradition. Bran the Broken would not father children, ensuring that the succession would not become hereditary but would remain elective. Sansa ruled the North as its queen, the first woman to hold that title in her own right in recorded history. Arya, unable to settle into the life of a lady after everything she had experienced, sailed west beyond the maps, seeking to discover what lay beyond the Sunset Sea. And Jon, exiled to the Night's Watch as punishment for killing Daenerys, eventually chose to travel beyond the Wall with the Free Folk, finding peace among those who asked nothing of him but his presence. The legacy of House Stark extends far beyond the individuals who bore the name. The principles they represented, the values they embodied, and the sacrifices they made shaped the history of Westeros in fundamental ways. From Bran the Builder raising the wall to protect humanity from the darkness beyond, through 8,000 years of kings of winter who ruled with honor and strength, to the final generation who saved the world from the dead and broke the wheel of tyranny, the Starks demonstrated that honor, duty, and family could endure even the worst that fate could deliver. The words of House Stark, "Winter is coming," proved to be more than just a reminder of changing seasons. They were a philosophy of life, a recognition that hard times would always return, and that only preparation, solidarity, and the strength to endure would see people through. The Starks understood that comfort was temporary, that security was an illusion, and that the only things that truly mattered were the bonds between people and the courage to do what was right, even when it cost everything. The survival of the Stark line, against all odds, and despite catastrophes that would have destroyed lesser houses multiple times over, demonstrated a resilience that transcended mere luck. The old gods, whether they existed as conscious entities or merely as forces woven into the fabric of the world, seemed to have watched over the Starks in their darkest hours. The weirwood trees, with their carved faces that had witnessed 8,000 years of Stark history, remained as silent observers of all that had transpired, their red sap like blood tears for all that had been lost and all that had been preserved. Winterfell itself, that ancient castle built by Bran the Builder over hot springs that warmed it through the longest winters, stood as a monument to Stark endurance. The castle had been burned and rebuilt, besieged and defended, abandoned and reclaimed, but it endured. The castle's godswood, with its heart tree whose face had been carved by the children of the forest before the coming of men, remained a place of power and mystery. The crypts beneath the castle, extending down into the darkness and holding the stone effigies of generations of Stark lords and kings, preserved the memory of all who had come before. The direwolves that had bonded with the Stark children at the beginning of their story proved to be more than mere pets or companions. They were symbols of the house, connections to the old magic that still lingered in the world, and reflections of the Starks themselves. Ghost, Jon's albino wolf, followed him beyond the wall to whatever future awaited there. Nymeria, Arya's wolf, led a great pack in the Riverlands, becoming almost a legend among the smallfolk. The other direwolves, those who had died, were mourned not just as animals but as parts of the family, pieces of the pack that could never be truly replaced. The relationship between the Starks and the North itself transcended mere political authority. The Northerners were not subjects but fellow members of a larger community, united by shared values and mutual obligation. The Lords of the North did not follow the Starks merely out of feudal duty, but because the Starks embodied the Northern way of life, the principles that allowed survival in a harsh land. When the Starks called, the North answered, and when the North needed leadership, the Starks provided it. This relationship, forged over 8,000 years and tested repeatedly by fire and blood, represented something rare and precious in a world dominated by ambition and treachery. The religious practices of the North, centered on the old gods and the weirwood trees, remained distinct from the faith of the Seven that dominated the rest of Westeros. This religious difference was not merely a matter of which gods people worshipped, but represented a fundamental difference in worldview. The old gods were nameless, silent, and made no promises of reward or punishment. They simply were, like the trees they inhabited, like the stones and streams and forests of the North. The Northerners did not expect their gods to intervene or to care about their individual fates. They sought only to live with honor, to do their duty, and to face whatever came with courage. This philosophy shaped the Northern character and made the North distinct from the more elaborate and sometimes hypocritical religious culture of the South. The tradition of Stark lords personally executing those they condemned to death, wielding ice, or later the Valyrian steel sword Longclaw, represented a philosophy of justice that set them apart from other rulers. Most lords delegated the unpleasant business of execution to headsmen or hangmen, distancing themselves from the consequences of their judgments. But the Starks understood that the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword, that rulers must take personal responsibility for their decisions about life and death. This tradition forced each lord to look into the eyes of the condemned, to see them as human beings, and to carry the weight of their deaths. It was a burden that weighed heavily, but it was also a guard against the casual exercise of power that could turn into tyranny. The great houses of the North, bound to Winterfell through oaths of fealty and marriage alliances and shared history, Each contributed to the northern identity in their own way. The Umbers of Last Hearth, closest to the wall and bearing the brunt of wildling raids, exemplified northern courage and ferocity. The Mandaleys of White Harbor, maintaining southern customs while proving their northern loyalty through action, demonstrated that the North could accommodate different traditions without losing its essential character. The mountain clans, poor in worldly goods but rich in pride and loyalty, showed that the bonds of honor transcended wealth and power. Even the Boltons, with their dark history and persistent treachery, represented a part of the Northern experience, a reminder that not all who claimed Northern blood embodied Northern values. The relationship between House Stark and the Night's Watch remained special throughout the millennia of their coexistence. The Starks understood the importance of the Watch in ways that Southerners never did. They sent their younger sons to take the Black, provided supplies and support, and personally led expeditions beyond the Wall when the situation demanded it. The Kings of Winter had visited the Wall regularly, inspecting the fortifications and meeting with the leadership. Even after becoming wardens rather than kings, the Starks maintained this tradition of support and involvement. The Watch, in turn, looked to Winterfell as their most reliable ally, the one great house that truly understood their mission and would support them regardless of political considerations. The economic foundations of Northern power, though less spectacular than the gold mines of the West or the fertile fields of the Reach, proved sufficient to maintain the Starks' position over the millennia. The North was poor by Southern standards, its climate too harsh for the kind of intensive agriculture that made the Reach wealthy, but it possessed resources that were valuable in their own way. The forests provided timber for construction and shipbuilding. The mountains held iron and other metals. The sea supplied fish in abundance. The North was largely self-sufficient, capable of feeding and equipping its own people without depending on imports from the South. This economic independence complemented the North's fierce desire for political autonomy. The Northern Army, when fully mustered, could field tens of thousands of soldiers, making it a formidable military force despite the region's relatively sparse population. Northern soldiers, hardened by the brutal climate and accustomed to privation, made excellent warriors who could endure hardships that would break Southern men. They lacked the elaborate armor and trained war horses that characterized Southern chivalry, but they compensated through toughness, loyalty, and the kind of grim determination that came from living in a land where weakness meant death. The mountain clans, the men of the Dreadfort, the Umber Giants, and the countless smaller houses that could each field a few dozen or a few hundred men, combined to create an army that had proven its worth repeatedly over the centuries. The cultural achievements of the North, while less celebrated than the artistic and literary traditions of the South, possessed their own value and beauty. Northern music, played on simple instruments and sung in harsh Northern accents, captured the essence of life in a hard land. The songs spoke of winter, of wolves and ice, of heroes who died defending the Wall, of ancient kings and legendary battles. Northern craftsmanship, whether in woodworking, ironmongery, or the construction of sturdy stone buildings that could withstand the fiercest storms, emphasized function and durability over ornamentation. The practical skills that allowed survival in the North were valued more highly than the refined arts that flourished in more temperate climates. The position of women in Northern society differed somewhat from Southern customs, reflecting the practical necessities of survival in a harsh environment. While Northern women were generally expected to fulfill traditional roles as wives and mothers, they were also valued for their strength and capability. The examples of Northern women leading in times of crisis, managing estates during their husbands' absences, or even taking up arms when necessary, were not unheard of and were generally respected rather than condemned. The tradition of naming women as heirs in the absence of male heirs, while not unique to the North, was more readily accepted than in the South. This practical attitude toward gender roles would eventually lead to Sansa Stark being accepted as queen in the North without significant opposition. The education of Northern children prepared them for lives that were fundamentally different from those of their Southern counterparts. While highborn children learned their letters and studied history and mathematics under the guidance of maesters, they also learned practical skills that could mean the difference between life and death. Northern boys learned to hunt, to track, to survive in the wilderness. They learned to judge weather and recognize the signs of approaching winter. They learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to find shelter and make fire in hostile conditions. These skills, considered beneath the dignity of southern nobles, were essential knowledge for anyone who might find themselves caught outside when winter storms struck. The small folk of the north, whether farmers, craftsmen, or laborers, lived lives that were harder than those of their southern equivalents. The growing season was short, the winters brutal, and the margin for error small, but they possessed a fierce pride in their ability to endure, to survive through determination and mutual support. The northern small folk expected less from their lords than southern commoners, understanding that the harsh climate limited what even the most benevolent ruler could provide. But they also expected certain fundamental things: fair treatment, protection from injustice, and leadership that embodied the values it claimed to represent. The Starks, at their best, provided these things, and the loyalty they received in return was deep and genuine. The concept of guest right, that sacred obligation to protect anyone who had eaten bread and salt beneath your roof, remained more powerful in the north than anywhere else in Westeros. The violation of guest right was considered one of the worst possible crimes, an offense against both gods and men that could never be forgiven or forgotten. The Red Wedding's horrific breach of this custom earned the Freys and Boltons a level of hatred and contempt that transcended ordinary political enmity. The North would never forgive, never forget, and eventually, they would exact a terrible vengeance for what had been done under the protection of guest right. The dreams and visions that ran through the Stark bloodline suggested connections to powers and knowledge from the Age of Heroes. The ability to warg, to enter the minds of animals and control them, appeared repeatedly in Stark children, though it often went unrecognized for what it was. The prophetic dreams that troubled various Starks throughout their history hinted at abilities that went beyond normal human perception. Bran the Builder's legendary deeds, the tales of skin changers and greenseers in the family's past, and the special relationship between the Starks and the old gods all suggested that something of the ancient magic still lived in their blood, dormant most of the time but capable of manifesting when circumstances required it. The crypts of Winterfell, extending down into the earth beneath the castle, served as both memorial and mystery. The stone effigies of dead Stark lords and kings, with iron swords laid across their laps to keep their spirits from walking, lined the passages in endless procession. The oldest statues, worn by time until features and names were illegible, dated back to the Age of Heroes. The more recent dead were better preserved, their faces carved with skill to capture their likenesses. The crypts were more than just a burial place. They were a physical connection to 8,000 years of history, a reminder that the Starks were part of something larger and more enduring than any individual life. The prophecies and legends surrounding the prince that was promised and Azor Ahai, the hero who would save the world from darkness, became entangled with Stark history in ways that only became clear in retrospect. Jon Snow, revealed to be a Targaryen with Stark blood through his mother, fit many of the criteria, though whether he was truly the prophesied hero remained ambiguous. Arya, who struck the killing blow against the Night King, accomplished what the prophecies seemed to promise, though she did it through skill and determination rather than destiny. The ambiguity surrounding these prophecies demonstrated that fate and free will were not as separate as people imagined. The theme of resurrection and return echoed through the final generation of Starks in ways that suggested more than coincidence. Jon was literally resurrected from death. Bran died, in a sense, when he became the Three-Eyed Raven, his human personality subsumed into something greater. Arya became no one before reclaiming her identity as Arya Stark. Sansa shed her naive beliefs and was reborn as a political player. Even Rickon, though his physical death was final, was resurrected in the memories and purposes of those who survived. The Stark children had to die in various ways to become the people they needed to be. The questions of justice and revenge that haunted the Starks throughout their trials were never fully resolved. Arya's list of names, people she intended to kill for what they had done to her family, drove much of her journey. Some names were crossed off through her own actions, others through the intervention of fate. But the process of revenge never brought the satisfaction or closure that she had imagined. The people she killed were dead, but her family was not restored. The satisfaction of justice served was fleeting, replaced quickly by the recognition that vengeance could not heal the wounds that had been inflicted. The Starks learned, through bitter experience, that while justice was necessary, revenge was ultimately empty. The supernatural elements that surrounded the Stark story, from the direwolves to the wargs to the greenseers, suggested that the line between the natural and supernatural was more permeable than most people believed. The world was stranger and more magical than the Maesters, with their chains and their rational explanations, were willing to admit the old gods were not merely symbols or philosophical concepts, but genuine forces that could affect events in tangible ways. The wall between life and death was not as solid as people hoped. Magic, dying after the last dragons perished, had returned to the world, and the Starks, with their ancient bloodlines and their connection to the old gods, were particularly sensitive to these forces. The political philosophy that emerged from the Stark experience emphasized duty, honor, and the good of the community over personal ambition. This philosophy was not naive, as critics sometimes claimed, but rather was based on a clear-eyed understanding of what was necessary for survival in a harsh world. The Starks recognized that selfish ambition and the breaking of oaths led to chaos and suffering. They understood that leaders must be willing to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good. They knew that the respect and loyalty of subordinates had to be earned through example rather than demanded through force. These principles, when actually followed rather than merely proclaimed, created strong communities and stable governance. The question of whether the Stark way was superior to the more pragmatic and ruthless approach favored by houses like the Lannisters remained debatable. The Starks' commitment to honor cost them dearly. Ned's unwillingness to lie or bend his principles led directly to his death. Robb's decision to execute Lord Karstark, while legally correct, was politically disastrous. The Starks seemed to collect tragedies and disasters in proportion to their virtue. But in the end, when the world faced its greatest threat, it was Stark leadership and Stark values that rallied the living against the dead. The cynical players of the Game of Thrones, for all their cunning, could not inspire the kind of loyalty and sacrifice that the Starks could command. The restoration of House Stark and the North's return to independence represented a vindication of sorts for the Northern way of life. The North had suffered terribly during the wars that followed Robert's death. Winterfell had burned, the Northern army had been destroyed at the Red Wedding, and the land had been devastated by war and occupation. But the North endured, and when the final accounting was made, it was a Stark who sat on the throne in King's Landing, and a Stark who ruled as Queen in the North. The pack survived, scattered and changed, but still fundamentally themselves. The future of House Stark remained uncertain in ways that were both troubling and hopeful. Bran, as king, would have no children, ensuring that his line would end with him. Sansa, as queen in the North, needed to produce heirs to secure the succession, but her experiences had left her cautious about marriage and men. Arya had sailed west, seeking adventure in unknown lands, with no intention of marrying or producing children. Jon, beyond the wall with the free folk, was unlikely to father legitimate children who could claim the Stark name. The continuation of the family would depend on decisions and circumstances that could not be predicted. But perhaps the question of biological descent missed the larger point. The Stark legacy was not merely genetic, but cultural and philosophical. The values that House Stark represented, the principles they embodied, and the example they set would influence the North and the rest of Westeros for generations, regardless of whether the family name continued. Winter is coming was not just the words of one house, but a philosophy of life that had proven its worth through 8,000 years of history. The recognition that hard times will return, that only preparation and solidarity can see communities through, that duty matters more than glory. These were lessons that transcended any single family or bloodline. The story of House Stark, from the mists of the Age of Heroes to the uncertainties of the future, represented in miniature the story of humanity itself. People face impossible challenges, suffer terrible losses, and somehow find the strength to endure. They make mistakes, sometimes catastrophic ones, but they learn and adapt. They are betrayed and disappointed, but they maintain their capacity for love and loyalty. They are knocked down repeatedly, but they get back up, because that is what survival requires. The Starks were not perfect, not invincible, not even always successful, but they were resilient, honorable in their own way, and ultimately triumphant despite everything fate threw at them. The wolves of Winterfell, whether the dire wolves that bonded with the Stark children, or the metaphorical wolves represented by the family itself, embodied qualities that enabled survival in a hostile world. Wolves were loyal to their pack, fierce in defense of their territory, and capable of enduring hardships that would kill softer creatures. They were intelligent, adaptable, and patient when patience was required. Most importantly, they understood that the pack survived when its members supported each other, that lone wolves died while the pack endured. The Starks, at their best, embodied these qualities, and it was these qualities that enabled them to survive when all seemed lost. The Godswood at Winterfell, that ancient grove with its weirwood tree whose face had witnessed 8,000 years of Stark history, remained the spiritual heart of the castle and the family. The tree had watched Brandon the Builder raise the first stones. It had seen the kings of winter come and go through countless generations. It had witnessed Torrhen Stark kneel before Aegon the Conqueror. It had been present for every oath sworn, every judgment rendered, every tragedy endured, and it would remain, silent and eternal, bearing witness to whatever future awaited House Stark and the North. The completion of the circle, from the Age of Heroes through 8,000 years of history and back to a situation that echoed those ancient times, suggested that history moved in patterns rather than straight lines. The Starks had begun as kings, become subjects, and were now divided between king in the south and queen in the north. The threats that had seemed like ancient history had returned, been defeated, and would presumably return again someday. The magic that had faded with the death of the dragons had returned with their rebirth. The world was strange and dangerous and wonderful, just as it had been in the beginning. The legacy of House Stark would endure not because of their victories or their power, but because of what they represented. In a world of ambition and cruelty, they stood for honor. In a realm of broken promises and betrayed trusts, they maintained their word. In a society that valued cunning and ruthlessness, they emphasized duty and compassion. They were not always right, not always wise, and certainly not always successful. But they tried, they endured, and they remained fundamentally decent, even when decency seemed like foolishness. The story that began with Bran the Builder raising Winterfell and the Wall had not truly ended, despite the deaths and departures of the most recent generation. House Stark would continue in some form, because the North needed what the Starks represented, needed the continuity and the values they embodied. The specifics might change, the family might evolve in unexpected ways, but the essential core would remain, because winter would always come, and the North would always need someone to remind them to prepare, to endure, to survive. In the great Game of Thrones, where so many players schemed and killed and died for power, the Starks had never been the most clever or the most ruthless. But they had been something perhaps more important. They had been true. True to their word, true to their values, true to each other, and true to the North they served. And in the end, when all the clever players had destroyed each other and all the powerful armies had bled themselves white, it was the truth and steadfastness of House Stark that prevailed. Not because truth always triumphs, but because, in a world of lies and betrayals, genuine integrity became the rarest and most valuable commodity of all. The wolves of Winterfell had howled through 8,000 years of history, their song echoing from the Age of Heroes to the present day. That song told of duty and honor, of family and survival, of the endless struggle against darkness, both literal and metaphorical. It was not always a triumphant song, not always a happy one, but it was true. And as long as there was a north, as long as winter continued to come, that song would continue, carried forward by those who understood what the Starks had always known. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives.